All right, we got a couple different questions here. I'll probably pick and choose a few. What kind of lights should be used on public streets? So let's talk about that one for a second. That's a kind of an interesting one. If you were asking me this question even a year ago, I would say absolutely HIDs, high intensity discharge lights. So metal halides, sodium discharge lights. There's a whole series of HID lights, high intensity discharge lights, that are super efficient. Don't necessarily have the best color rendering, but like really who cares? It's a public street. They're very efficient and long lasting, and just completely make sense for that kind of use, that kind of low level use where you need to get a lot of light because it's probably pretty high up in the air, and it's going to cover a pretty big area. And the high intensity discharges, they operate kind of similar to how a fluorescent operates. They're actually in the same family of lighting fixtures, but they're sort of a little different, a little more specific. Their big downsides is they don't turn on fast, but that doesn't matter for a public street. You know, you don't need it to like come on in half a second. If it takes 4 or 5 minutes for it to turn on, that's fine. So high intensity discharge is the likely answer. In actuality, in the last year, 2 years, 6 months, I've actually seen quite a lot of articles about how cities are moving over to these brand new LEDs. It took a long time for the LEDs to sort of find their markets in ways that could fit to the needs that people were having. And the thing that the municipalities love about the LEDs for public streets is that the advantage, people always think that the LEDs are much more energy efficient than like HIDs, and for the most part they're not really. From what I've seen, the LEDs are pretty close, but actually not as efficient. But the big advantage that they have, they probably will become more efficient as they get better, but the big advantage they have right now is they last longer. And if you're a municipality and you can have a situation where instead of having to change the street lights every 3 years or every 5 years or something, if you can do it every 7 years, that's a big cost difference from just the man hours. So I honestly don't know whether the exam is caught up to the LEDs on that kind of thing. So I would think of those two. I think if they offer LEDs, that's probably the answer. If LEDs isn't offered, then HIDs would be the logical answer. All right, let's see. Yeah. So what are the properties of non-cohesive soils? Actually, I'm going to jump to the previous one. What happens in phase 1 versus phase 2? I'm assuming this is an environmental phase 1 that the question is about, an environmental phase 2. So if you're somebody who has just bought a piece of land or is in the process of buying a piece of land, and you're talking to the seller, and the seller has to tell you some piece of information because that's the law, you can't hide things, and the seller tells you, oh, by the way, there used to be a manufacturing thing on this site that made adhesives. And you'd be like, wow, adhesives, that sounds toxic. I'll bet there's a lot of problems on the site. Do you have a phase 1? And what the phase 1 would tell somebody, and if they didn't, you might get it, but somebody would have to get the phase 1 in that situation. The environmental phase 1 is going to be a situation where sort of knowledgeable entity, there's companies that do this work, specifically environmental engineers, would go out and do not testing, but they would do kind of a walkthrough, take a look at what they saw. They would do an analysis of the historical records of the site. And so they would kind of do a paperwork and kind of quick walkthrough version of an environmental analysis. If when they're walking through, they see things that they absolutely know, like the classic one is the 9x9 floor tiles, which usually have asbestos in them, or they see pipe wrap that has asbestos, or they see what there's kind of the remnants of old tanks of what might be toxic chemicals around the site, something like that. If they see it, if they physically see it, well, then that goes into phase 1. And that either tells people that they should do or not do whatever they're going to do next, but it would effectively kick in the need to have a phase 2. If they do the walkthrough, they don't see anything, but then they do the paperwork stuff and they look around, they find all the historical data, and they realize, oh wait, this is definitely a place that is a likely place where there's a problem, then that would kick in the phase 2. But if they do the walkthrough and they do the sort of quick analysis of all of the historical data and they don't see anything that seems like a smoking gun, then there's really no need to do the phase 2, and you sort of hope for the best, and it's sort of a way that people can not get sucked into huge costs in environmental analysis and still kind of keep a project rolling along. But if anything tips it off and it says, no, this looks kind of dangerous, we haven't done the test yet, but this seems like there's a problem, then you do the phase 2. The phase 2 is much more expensive and much more specific, and they'll go through and test everything, send it to testing agencies, and maybe you have to do digging on the site to find tanks in the ground or whatever it happens to be. They'll look for everything and test the soils, test the paint, test the pipe wrap, all of that stuff. So it's a much more involved, much longer process. But then what comes out of it is the environmental report, and that phase 2 environmental report will have all sorts of information, not only about what was found, but also about the best way to tackle it. So if encapsulation makes sense, it'll say we recommend encapsulation for these areas and not for these areas. If removal makes sense, then they'll talk about that. It's sort of a big sort of what's there, what's the problem, and how to deal with it process. Whereas the phase 1, fairly simple, keep it nice and easy. People can figure out whether they really need to go to the phase 2 or not, but it kind of gets you to that spot where you can make a reasonable decision.